Yeah, hello friends, welcome to my channel. Today we are going to see one more concept regarding Kubernetes, which is resource management for pods and containers, right? So when you talked about resource management, right, two main resources come to our mind. One is CPU and memory. There are other resources in Kubernetes, but we'll talk mainly on CPU and memory. And the purpose of this video to understand how you can manage resources and how you can specify that resource requirement when you are creating YAML file for your pod, right? Look at request and limits. These are the two main keywords, request and limits. And what is difference between that, you will understand after seeing this tutorial. And that is the main difference or main understanding you should have within request and limits. So request is something, this is a bare minimum requirement for your pod or container to run on any node. So for example, if you are asking request of one CPU for one container within the pod and you have two containers for that particular pod. So one container asks for request CPU 1 and just consider that 1 as a unit, but CPU 1 for container 1 and CPU 2 for container 2. So total requirement for that pod to run is 3 CPUs. When you request or create the pod with having that requirement of 3 CPUs, you will specify under requests, right? So what Kube scheduler will look at is, it looks at resource requirement or under request resource, and it says, okay, CPU 1 for one container, CPU 2 for second container, total 3 CPUs. So it will look at available nodes in the cluster, and Kube scheduler use that request information and put the pod in specific node, right? And say like you have 3 CPU requirement for that particular pod, and that is good, you are able to schedule that. When you reach that limit, like for example, you are giving limit for first pod as 3 CPUs and limit for second pod as well as 3 CPUs, right? So what happens is, so that limits resource, Kubelet will look at for a running container. It will look at, okay, it has a requirement of 2 CPUs and it's running fine. Now it's asking for 3 CPUs. Its requirement increases based on the processing and asking for 3 CPUs. And it looks at the limits specified and it is 3 CPU. Okay, we can accommodate that 3 CPU on the node. So let's give that 3 CPU to the container and let it run. But say container is like asking more CPU than what it is specified. Then that time Kubelet cannot allow that container to use more than 3 CPUs because that is the limit we have specified for that container. So that's when limits come into picture. And like for CPU resource, limit will just throttle your container. It's just having throttling effect. But for the memory resource, it will just evict that pod, right? If you are having 10 megabytes of requirement, right, in the request, but you limit it say 50 megabyte, right? You can scale your usage of the memory till 50 megabyte, but beyond that Kubelet will just evict it. If you are going beyond limits number, then it will just evict it. So that is a subtle difference between request and limit. So request is something telling the minimum requirement for the resource, and limits is telling maximum how much it can scale. So similar thing I want to show you in Kubernetes documentation. Specifically guys, if you are working on CKA exam, Certified Kubernetes Administrator, it is very important that you get used to using documentation more often than not, so that like during exam this documentation will be available for us and we can refer that. So here I just search for resource management, and the same thing what I was just explaining using deck, right? So same thing, I'll just take a minute and show you how you can see it in documentation. So again, like requests and limits are two important keywords. For example, if you set memory requirement of 256 megabyte, I'll not get into what is megabyte and megabyte, but just consider the 256 megabyte of a requirement for a container, and that container is a pod scheduled to a node with 8 GB of memory and no other pods, then the container can try to use more RAM. If you set memory limit of 4 GB for that container, the Kubelet enforce the limit. So what we just saw is your request is 250 megabyte, right? And you have 8 GB for the memory on that particular node, so it can scale and use more memory if it is required for that pod. But if you set a limit of 4 GB, then kubelet will enforce that limit. So the runtime prevents the container from using more than the configured resource limit. For example, when a process in the container tries to consume more than the allowed amount of memory, the system kernel terminates the process that attempted the allocation with an out of memory error. And like this is very good to know, because during troubleshooting scenario in CK exam, you may need to use this knowledge. So just pay attention to that. So if your memory limit is specified of 4 GB, even though you have 8 GB on the node, you cannot go beyond that. So kubelet will enforce that 4 GB limit and like it evict your pod in that case, right? So this is resource and limit. And how you can specify resource and limit, I can just quickly show that, right? Under resources, you can specify the request, memory and CPU of certain value, and under limits you can specify the limit. So limit, it's obvious, limits cannot be less than request. So request is the first thing what kube scheduler will look at, and based on the request requirement it decides which node to be used for placing that pod, and kubelet will look into the limit and it will not allow to scale this particular pod or container beyond the specified limit under limits, right? So that is the difference between request and limit. Requests are important for kube scheduler and limits are important for kubelet or container runtime to enforce that limit. Okay, so let me just go to like our Kubernetes cluster and let me see whether we have any pods running. Okay, we don't have any pod, and K I am using just the alias, so you can just use kubectl. I'm just using K for the alias, and we have seen the same thing in my earlier tutorial why I'm using K, just to make it faster, right? So let me just show you this pod YAML file, right? So here everything else is same, like there will be API version, kind, metadata and spec. Under spec you will mention container, which is like it can be a multiple container, so it is an array which is very clear with the dash, and then image, name, and under resource, so you can see that it is under container. So each container inside pod will have a different resource requirement, right? And when you kube scheduler is using this information, it will just sum all the request limit or request requirement for each of the container. So here it's just one container and CPU is 0.25, right? And memory is 100 megabyte, and CPU limit is CPU 1 and memory limit is 500 megabyte. So right, so when you are kube scheduler is scheduling it, it look at, okay, CPU is 0.25 and memory is 100 megabyte. So you just look at the node, and wherever it can satisfy this request, it will put pod there. And then kubelet or container runtime just look at, okay, CPU is 1 and we are okay to scale this particular container up to 1. If it is going beyond that, let's throttle it. And for memory, you can scale up to 500 megabytes. If it's go beyond it's going beyond that, just evict that, and with the error what we have seen. So let's create the pod. Okay, so pod is created. You can see pod is created. It's still okay. It was still container creating stage, but now if you see the status, it is running. So you can see resource requirement for this pod what we specified using this command as well. Describe pod in Nginx. So if you see this here also, it is very clear what we asked for. Request is this and limits is this, right? So this just translate to 0.25 CPUs and 100 and 500 megabytes. So this is what it is, like request and limit. If you just, this is very simple concept, but like it takes time to just appreciate how this request and limits are different. Okay, so that's it guys. I hope you learned something new and you enjoy learning Kubernetes fundamentals. If so, please let me know in the comment, like if this tutorial or this video is making sense to you or it is useful for you, so I can create more conceptual videos under Kubernetes playlist. And there are multiple other tutorials I have created in the past, so please refer that. let me know how you like, or what is your comments about this particular series as a whole. And if any of you are planning for CK exam and pass it, I would love to know that and celebrate your success. Thank you. We'll meet with another tutorial in Kubernetes fundamental series. Thank you. Bye for now. Hope you learned something new today. If so, please like this video, share, leave your comment so that I know this content is helping you. Don't forget to subscribe, and that's now. Okay, see you again with yet another exciting tutorial about AWS. Keep learning, keep sharing what you learn, and thanks for watching.